Can silence leaven itself like bread, rising in the dark until it breaks the crust of a morning no one expected? Can the crack of a crust mask the hushed stirring of judgment, carried not by sword or fire, but by a loaf set gentle as a prayer upon a table? And can the fields themselves, those long green tongues that lick sweat from the living, taste at last the flavour of a debt returned? Georgia, 1807. The sun wrote its old sermon across furrows and backs, and the crows read it aloud. Somewhere between the hymn of daybreak and the hiss of kettles, a vow rose like steam, invisible but hot. It would have neither trumpet nor shout, only the patient grammar of a kitchen, and the final period placed by a quiet hand. Pause here. Hold the breath with me. This is not spectacle, it is testimony the world tried to forget. If you wish to travel with us through the silences that history left behind, then heed this invitation. If you want to follow real stories that defy time and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our investigations. Now, let us return to the house that creaked and the field that remembered. At dawn, the house groaned like an elderly ship, stretching its ribs against the day's first heat. The porch boards puffed out dust the colour of old flour. Inside, the kitchen breathed softly, as if a sleeping animal had been left there to keep watch. Banked coals, a blackened kettle, an iron skillet seasoned by years of hunger. In this room, time had two measures: how long it took bread to rise, and how long it took a man to swallow a command. The plantation's main road ran like a scar between house and fields. Cypress and magnolia kept their own counsel, lifting their shadows as lightly as black veils from a widow's face. The overseer, Mr. Harland, wore his whip like a necktie cut from storm cloud. He did not use words to speak when glances could bruise just as cleanly. His boots struck the packed earth with the rhythm of rules. Summer did its old work. It turned the air into a wet blanket and the hours into a chain. The rows of cotton lay open-mouthed, thirsty for hands. Bales would come later, for now there were only the endless white buds and the brown pop of bowl hulls, the blood prick of thorns that had learned the shape of fingers. Children chased shade that never stayed, as if each were a prayer bead, as if each had a memory inside it. In the big house, sugar whispered in jars and tea leaves breathed from their tin tombs. Spoons clinked like tiny hammers, sealing a coffin. The pantry shelves held ranks of flour in sagging sacks, lard in crockery, salt that knew the taste of tears. Bread was the house's heartbeat. Every day it rose, every day it was cut, every day it was buttered and praised by mouths that had never learned the grammar of hunger. Morning bells were not bells at all, but the crow call, the cattle low, the wooden buckets striking the well lip. Smoke went up, orders went out, names were rolled and unrolled like twine. On the front steps, a newspaper lay like a sleeping dog, its headlines panting about tariffs, elections, treaties, things that tasted of other men's worries. In the quarters, news arrived by dust and rumour. A birth last night in the corner cabin, a tooth lost to rot, a song that hummed itself awake in the throat of a woman who remembered a river far away. The seasons were not four, but two, work and the aching between. Winter had once brought frost, crisp as a new sheet, but even then the fields did not sleep, they only whispered. Summer, though, was a tyrant, and the cicadas were its choir. They soared at the day until it was sawdust. The house kept trying to be holy as a church. Linen starched like scripture, silver bright, but the holiness never reached the floor of the kitchen, never crossed the threshold of the quarters, never bent to pick up a dropped bowl without scolding the hand that dropped it. Mr. Harlan kept his ledger near his bed, a leather book fat with arithmetic and sin. Names marched there like condemned men. Isaac, Ruth, Jacob, Dinah, Moses, Leah, credits for labour, debits for breath. He tallied lashes as if they were coins. He wrote the word bread, sometimes bread issued, bread cost, never once the word hunger. He He had a way of stepping into a room that made the room apologize for being small. And yet even tyrants have habits humble as any farmer's. Every Sabbath afternoon he insisted on a loaf still warm, a crust that crackled like a secret when cut. He called it Christian rest. The knife sang across the bread's back, and butter softened at the edges like mercy trying to make itself believable. He ate half, saved half, and slept with his window open as if air were proof of innocence. There was a woman in the kitchen whose hands knew the weight of each bowl and the angle each spoon must lie to quiet the noise in the overseer's head. There was a boy who fetched wood, who sucked splinters from his fingers, who watched fire with a scholar's attention. There was a man who folded his silence into the dough of every day, who kneaded it with patience until it no longer stuck to him. The house believed itself a kind of kingdom, but kingdoms fall when their bricks learn to listen. My name is Ezra, though it has been called other things by other mouths. I was not born to this ground, though this ground has pretended to be my father. My mother told me once, before her voice became a kind of weather, that the sea does not remember names, only salt. I learned to keep mine in my chest like a dry seed that might survive a season no one survives. I kept a ledger too, though I never owned a book. My ledger lived under my ribs. It had no ink but memory, and no lines but scars. I turned its pages when I could not sleep, which was most nights. I fingered the old entries the way a blind man reads the shape of the moon. There was the day my brother Jacob's back cracked like winter ice under the overseer's storms. There was the Thursday Ruth's baby came feet first, and the woman who could have saved them was told the big house's laundry had its own emergencies. There was the morning I shared a heel of bread with Dinah and watched the overseer's dog watch us, wanting both our bread and our fear. I learned the mathematics of silence. 1 word cost 3 punishments, 1 glance, 2, 1 laugh at the wrong time, interest compounded until it owned your sleep. I learned that gratitude was a plate that never arrived full, and when it did, hands reached in before yours. I learned that time itself could be trained. Teach it to hold its breath, to carry a weight without asking what it was. There was a year when the frost came early and bit the okra down to stumps, when the cotton bolls froze like tiny fists. We burned what we had to warm what we kept. Harlan laughed when he saw us warming our hands over a pot where water boiled without meat. "Soup of nothing," he said, and lifted my chin with the handle of his whip. Gently, like a father, I wrote that down too, in my ledger where there is a line reserved for gentle gestures that cut deep. When my mother died, it was a quiet death, lungs turning to thin cloth, breath making a small tent that collapsed with each exhale. I fed her sips of water with a spoon whose bowl had been dented by another mouth long ago. She smiled once, a small island of light in a long night, and touched my wrist. "Ezra," she said, "keep the good bread for the end." I did not understand then, I do now. I think a man does not choose vengeance. Vengeance chooses the only man who has learned its language. Mine came dressed as patience. It taught me the craft of waiting, the slow art of gathering. I collected hours the way a washerwoman collects pins, each small point kept hidden until the dress must be made. I collected looks too, the way Harlan chewed, the way he always drank water before he ate bread, the way he liked the crust brown as a field in August, the way he closed his eyes after the second bite, as if nothing in the room could surprise him for a whole breath. I became the kitchen's shadow. I learnt yeast's shy ways, how it prefers a gentled hand and a room without loud voices. I learned salt like a psalm, how a pinch could turn a bowl honest. I learned that flour floats in sunlight like a swarm of tiny ghosts, each one a story that once stood in a field. I learned the oven's moods, the ashes' silence, the fire's 2 tongues. I carried dough like an infant. I folded silence in with each turn. Books speak of poison as if it were a demon that leaps, but poison is not a leap, poison is a lesson. It sits, it studies, It waits for a host the way a memory waits for the right smell. The old women knew a dozen ways to ruin a body, roots that teach the heart to forget, berries that persuade the blood to walk slower. I did not ask them, it would have placed them in my ledger where I keep those who do not survive, and I wanted them all to live. What came to me came as a gift of noticing. In the storeroom, where jars waited like prisoners, there was a sack of rye that never baked right. The overseer's tongue preferred a soft crumb, noble dome, the white boast of it, while the lower tables took what the storeroom offered. Once, after a wet month, the rye had a smell that was off-greenish, like the river's breath when it's holding us. The women crossed themselves the way their mothers had taught them, different names for the same fear. That year the bread from the rye made men feel light and strange. Eyes widened, laughter came at the wrong places. The overseer said it was laziness masquerading as nerves. I wrote that down too, the rye's peculiar cheer, the way it bent sound. Ergot, the doctor called it once when he took tea on the porch, an educated word that felt like a bridle on a wild horse. But the sack was moved, the weather changed, the fields needed us sober. Patience has its own hunger. It is not satisfied by weeks, it wants years to chew. So I fed it. I learned where the storeroom key slept. I learned that mould has a calendar, and that calendars can be coaxed. I learned that in the right damp and the right time a good thing can go bad just enough to pass undetected through a man who never expected the kitchen to answer back. My ledger filled. There is a page titled Christmas Whispers, the night Harlan pulled Leah from her doorway while the stars looked away. There is a page titled The Rope's Sermon, when he made Jacob dance on nothing for stealing a handful of seed that could not be weighed by God himself. There is a page titled July Teeth, the day I bled into the dirt and tasted iron, and knew iron had learned to love. My mother's last words came again, keep the good bread for the end. I folded them into the dough of my days until they were part of me, not a sentence but a method. Bread would rise, the end would come warm. The house had its rituals, and rituals are the blind spots of tyrants. Sabbath bread, a loaf for the overseer, one for the table, one for the week's humility. He liked the shape called priest's hat, a cap round and proud, a little ridge where the dough split while it grew. He liked to score it with a cross, not out of piety, but because he said it helped the heat go in clean. I began with small obediences, the kind that fool a watcher into believing you are content to be watched. I polished the kneading board with lard until it shone. I cleaned the proofing basket with a brush made from straw and twine. I lined the bottom of the Dutch oven with leaves of chestnut to keep the crust from burning. I sang when I sifted, hymns with no words. The cook, Aunt Mercy, heard me and nodded like someone remembering a road. Quiet makes good bread, she said. Noise makes bread angry. There is a knowledge that is neither witchcraft nor science. It is born where survival rubs itself thin. I found the rye again, another sack, another season of damp. I learned to coax the bloom I needed, enough to make a proud man's heart miscount, enough to make his blood forget the path it should take. Not a murder's shout, but a taper snuffed between two fingers. It required weather and patience, and the careful deceit of air. Flour is a landscape. If you look close, it has hills and gullies. It remembers the wind that carried it. Rye, when ill, keeps a scent that wheat cannot hide. But there are masks. Molasses poured in a ribbon, a sweet river to drown a greenish whisper. Milk scalded and cooled to tame what would otherwise speak too soon. A crust baked darker, hymns sung a little louder, a door left open so the kitchen's breath could leave before anyone questioned why it was. I studied Harlan's day the way a hunter studies hoof prints. He never ate a full meal on a day of counting. He tasted, he chewed like a judge hearing a case not worth his time. Bread first, butter, then water, then meat if he thought the weather simple. I needed the bread to be the first word, and the last. The morning I chose came with a fog that made the world seem freshly erased. Trees wore their own breath like shawls. The sky did not yet know what kind of day it wanted to be. I lighted the coals gently. I mixed the sponge the night before, the prelude to bread, a small kingdom of bubbles that spoke in the language of patience. Aunt Mercy asked me nothing, which was mercy. Her eyes were 2 coins she paid me with their quiet. I sifted, I salted, I let the sponge swallow the flour like a saint taking in a vision. I folded my hunger into the dough, my hands became kneading, fist, heel, turn, fold, rest. The dough answered, at first stubborn, then supple, at first resentful, then ready. In another bowl the rye waited, its bloom invisible to those who do not live by their noses. I used it as one uses a spice, measured, hidden inside the familiar. There is a moment when dough stops resisting and begins to believe. It is a human moment too, perhaps a child when it first sleeps in a strange house without crying, perhaps a prisoner when the chain feels enough like a belt to be forgotten while eating. I shaped the loaf with a firmness that boarded up my shaking. I scored it with the cross he liked. I whispered another cross inside my chest and did not tell it what it meant. Bread is a clock, proof long enough and the hour you need arrives of its own will. I waited, I washed the bowl, I wiped the table twice, then once again to convince my hands they were finished. I stoked the oven until it sang, then let it hush. I set the loaf in, and the kitchen bowed its warm head. Time went by like a sore memory. Outside, the fields were already stitching themselves together with labour rows of backs, a quilt no one had the right to wrap around themselves. Harlan's boots rang on the porch. The ledger tucked under his arm made the leather squeak like something alive. The dog took his place by the threshold, eyes on the hand that fed him cruelty scraps. The loaf came out burnished, proud, hiding what it hid, the way a widow hides the knowledge that her husband was both a man and a storm. I brushed its crust with melted butter until it shone like a promise someone once kept. I set it upon the cooling rack and listened. Bread speaks then, a brittle murmuring as it exhales. Aunt Mercy closed her eyes at that tiny song. Amen, she said, as if a prayer had been answered without having been asked. There remained only the table and its ceremonies. The knife lay beside the loaf like a silver tongue. The butter grew soft in its own humility. I placed a jug of water, clean, cold, blameless, at the top of the setting. The air carried no alarm. I had bathed the kitchen in ordinary, and ordinary is the cloak that makes danger invisible. I did not think of the end. I thought of each step as if I were tilling a row, 1 foot, then another, 1 seed, then another. I placed the loaf before him when he came in, his hat in his hand as he swatted dust from his thigh. An intimacy reserved for men who feel the world as furniture. He sat. He blessed nothing. He nodded at the bread. Good crust, he said, not to me, but to the room, as if the house itself had arranged it all. He took the knife, he pressed, the crust sang its little crack, and then the slice lay before him, steam lifting like the spirit we are told leaves at the last breath. There are acts that arrive like storms, and there are acts that arrive like Sundays, quiet, inevitable, sanctified by habit. He raised the slice and took a bite. The bread yielded with a sigh. He chewed as he always chewed, as if patience were a virtue he had invented. I watched the second bite, always the second, the one that relaxes a man into trust. He reached for the water, as he always did, and swallowed in that small, confident pantomime of a king consuming a kingdom. Outside, a mule brayed at a fly. A bird knocked twice upon the shutters as if to mimic a door. Aunt Mercy's spoon rattled in a pot like a polite applause. The dog flicked his ear and lay down again, because dogs keep faith with routines, even when routines are sinners. He kept eating. The cross I had cut spread into the crumb like a map of a country where wheat and rye make their uneasy alliance. He told me to cut a piece for myself. I did, precisely, and set it on a separate plate that I never brought to my mouth. He smirked without looking, having added another line to my imaginary ledger, one that read, "Ezra obeys." I do not remember breathing. I remember being breathed. The room took long, slow inhalations and exhalations, as if deciding whether to keep us both alive. He set the slice down at last and wiped his fingers on the cloth as if absolution could be bought with linen. He reached for his ledger and opened it to the place where names stand to attention. Then the room shifted, perhaps a fraction to the left. A glass winked at the edge of the table. He frowned as one frowns when a sentence misbehaves. His tongue pursued a taste he could not name. The colour in his face did not name. It rearranged. He blinked, not believing that the kitchen could speak without his asking a question. "Hot," he said, though it was not heat that came for him, but a sort of quiet fire in the blood's house. He lifted the jug again. The water took its time, as if the throat had become a narrow road. He set the jug down, not where it belonged, but on the ledger itself. Wetting the page, he looked at me, and for the first time his eyes did not know where to place me. The dog rose, uncertain. Aunt Mercy kept her back turned with the precision of an angel who has seen too much and intends to remain one. I stepped slightly nearer, not to help and not to witness, but because the moment had the gravity of a well, and bodies orbit what they have spent years drawing toward them. His hand went to his chest, not dramatically, but like a man adjusting a button that has come loose. His breath shortened, then lengthened in the wrong places. He attempted to stand. The chair scraped the floor with a protest that would be the gossip of the quarters all week, how the chair told the story like an old woman with a great deal of time. He reached for the edge of the table. The knife turned and watched him with the dull attention of a well-fed cat. He did not curse. He did not pray. He looked for his ledger as if the sums might rescue him. The page had drunk some of the water and now wore a small blister of pulp where my name had once lain like a fly under glass. He reached again for the bread, as men reach for their first explanations. Perhaps it was the butter, perhaps the milk, perhaps the rye. He chewed again to test the hypothesis fate had put in his mouth. I saw, in the space between two breaths, the field outside, as if the house had become glass and the rose a hymn visible through walls. Men stooped, women straightened, children learned the geometry of absence. The sky stood by, terrible as an unblinking witness. The crows took a step nearer, to knowledge, not to meat. He sagged then, as a porch surrenders under too much sitting. His hat fell to the floor and lay brim up, a begging bowl. The ledger slid to his lap. The knife leaned against the loaf as if tired from its useful life. He made a sound like a door caught by a sudden wind, a brief, surprised "oh" that was not quite a word. I did not touch him. I am often asked in the silence of memory if I could have. The truth is that he had already been touched, by rain, by time, by the yeast of his own belief that nothing in this house mattered but his will. The bread did not persuade him to die, it only taught him the truth that had been kneading him all along. You are dust, and dust has an excellent memory. He slid to the side, carefully as if trying not to disturb the table's manners. The chair toppled, the dog barked once, a single question, then no more. Aunt Mercy set her spoon down and came to the doorway, but did not cross the threshold. She looked at me, and something walked between us, invisible and solemn as a pallbearer. Footsteps in the hall. The housekeeper, the boy with the wood, the maid with the water, each arrived as if summoned by a bell that no one had rung. They saw the bread, the butter, the body, and made the sign each knew. Crosses, whispers, hands to mouth. I stepped back into the kitchen's oldest shadow, where smoke has long ago rubbed its black upon the wall. I kept my face still. I kept my ledger closed. Outside the day went on because day has no choice. The cotton did not weep. The mules chewed. A blue feather found its way to the threshold and trembled there, like a sentence unwilling to be spoken. There was talk of doctors, and of fetching the master, and of run get help. People ran. Help did not arrive. Harlan had already entered a place where bread is either forgiven or not remembered at all. Brief, in the big house, preferred loud shoes. They clattered, they argued with air. They fetched the doctor, who took off his hat, then put it back on as if modesty could return the breath to a chest that had decided otherwise. He sniffed the bread, frowning at the butter, tasted neither. He wrote something on a slip that would become a record of the unrecordable. Heart, he said, as if hearts were known to spill their secrets when prompted by pen. In the quarters the news arrived like weather, first a wind that lifted heads, then a hush that pinned them down again. Children stared at doorways as if doorways might explain themselves. Old men sat a little straighter on their stumps and mashed snuff with a deliberation that looked like prayer. Women held their laps with both hands, as if preventing the world from climbing in and making itself comfortable. The dog howled once, then found a shadow and lay inside it. The fields learned a new quiet, a quiet that made the cicadas sound immodest. Somewhere a robin kept singing, proof that some songs do not check the news before they go on. The sun pretended not to notice the change, which is the only way suns survive their work. There were rumours as varied as the people who needed them. The rye had turned, the butter had been kept too near the stove. A curse had been placed upon the kitchen by a woman who had once been made to scrub the step with water so cold it taught her bones a new language. A man in a rag hat had been seen near the house last week, and it is known that men in rag hats bring mischief. A shadow had crossed the well and failed to return to its owner. The bread had been underbaked. The bread had been overbaked. The bread had been perfect, and that was suspicious. The neighbours came like crows when a field is ploughed, ready to eat the disturbances. They stood on the porch and performed the appropriate faces. They whispered words that had lace on them. They asked who had baked the bread, and were told the kitchen. They nodded, satisfied that kitchens act without hands. The ledger was found damp. Names had bled into one another like cousins at a funeral. The overseer's nephew dipped a finger into the water stain and licked it. A foolishness grief allows to the unhitched. He declared the taste ordinary, which was the only safety left to him. The doctor pocketed a coin. The master measured the fence with his eyes, as if boards could keep out what had already happened. No one spoke my name. Aunt Mercy did not speak hers either. The kitchen went about its business with the dignity of a church after a scandal. Services continue, sins are discussed in the yard. The oven cooled, ashamed of nothing. The knife lay in its drawer and slept. The proofing basket hung upon its nail like a crown awaiting its next. That night the quarters exhaled. We sat on low stools. The moon scratched its thin fingernail across the pines. Someone hummed a tune that had lost its words crossing the ocean. Dinah passed a heel of bread to the boy who fetched wood. He took it with both hands and ate with the careful gratitude of the nearly starved. No one mentioned the big house, no one mentioned the kitchen. We spoke of rain, and of a cow that needed mending at the hoof, and of a small hole in a roof that had learned to be a window. The master assigned a new man to count our breaths. He wore the whip with less imagination. His boots tried the old rhythm and could not quite find it. He ate cornbread the next Sabbath and called it fit. He kept 2 glasses of water near his plate, and 1 near the floor for the dog, and he looked at us the way a clock looks at a room, not unkindly, but with the certainty that his measure is the only measure. When the new preacher came to pour words over the overseer's grave, he spoke of wheat and chaff and the Lord's harvest. He praised bread for being the staff of life, and warned against temptation that rises like leaven. I stood at the back with my hands hidden in themselves. The soil pressed its cold through my shoes. The stone had not yet been carved with dates, and so the earth itself held the number of his years. The sky opened and closed its blue as if blinking. In newspapers, a few lines: death of an overseer, sudden apoplexy. The ink dried and the paper moved on to freight rates and cotton prices and a senator's speech. The slice of the world that was our world returned to its work, for what else can a field do but be a field? And yet something had shifted, like a door in an old house learning to close with a new click. The women baked with a straighter spine, the men lifted their sacks as if the weight had made a pact with them. Children played a game called Sabbath bread, where one child sits with eyes closed and the others pass a crust behind his back until the song ends and a different judge must be chosen. In my chest the ledger turned its own page. There were still many entries, many debts the world carried as if they were feathers. The bread had not ended hunger, it had only spoken to it in a language it respected. I lay on my pallet and watched the rafters walk the dark. I slept, I woke, I kept my hands open in my sleep, as if expecting the past to press something into them. Years do what years have always done. They fold themselves into a coat, and the living wear it whether it fits or not. The house weathered. The porch learned a new creak. The dog forgot the sound that had waked him. The rye came and went, as seasons will, its ghosts quiet, except for those nights when the river sweats and the frogs preach deep. A tale began to move, softly at first, like the hush of skirts in a church aisle. It said that bread once answered back in that house. It said a loaf can be more than flour and water. It can be a memory risen to full height. It said that in Georgia there is a field where the crows fly lower and the wheat bends respectfully when a certain wind comes down from the hills. It said that on Sabbath afternoons, if you listen near the kitchen door, you may hear a crust crack all by itself, once, twice, like a pair of knuckles being readied for prayer. Children gather tales the way pockets gather lint. They rolled this one between finger and thumb until it became soft enough to carry without fear. It reached other plantations where windows were the colour of smoke. It crossed a river on the back of a boatman's laugh. It climbed into a preacher's sermon and stood there like a parable that refused to identify itself. Some said a curse, some said the Lord, some said a woman in a blue bonnet who knew the names of every plant that grows in shade. Some said a man who could fold silence the way a woman folds sheets, corners neat, lines true. I have no desire to be hero or ghost. I wish only to be accuracy. A loaf rose, a man fell, the world did not change, and yet it did. I eat bread now with a care that borders on reverence. I tear my portion small, I leave the heel for whoever comes after me. I keep the bowl clean, because bowls remember. I thank the yeast out loud sometimes, to hear a living thing answer in bubbles. Once, years later, I walked the edge of the field at dusk, the hour when sorrows loosen their belts and sit with you without asking. Fireflies made sermons in their brief light. The house exhaled its day. I could smell a loaf cooling somewhere far off, its breath rising like an old hymn no one had written down, but everyone knew. I thought of my mother's counsel, keep the good bread for the end, and I understood that she had not meant death, but justice, a portion saved for a day when a hungry soul would need it most. They will ask who did it. They will ask for proof, for measurements, for testimonies signed with proper names. But the truth lives in smaller places, in a crumb that clung to a linen lip, in a water ring on a ledger where numbers once marched in cruel formation, in a dog's single question, in a wooden chair that remembers the weight it surrendered. The truth walks barefoot through kitchens. It keeps its voice low. It waits for rooms to empty. Then it speaks. Sometimes it is mistaken for the settling of old wood, but those who have lived with it know the difference. If you go there, to that house or what's left of it, stand by the cold oven, press your palm flat upon the blackened iron, you may feel a faint heat that does not belong to the present. You may hear the ash hift as if giving someone a place to sit, and if by chance a breeze from the fields slips through and lifts the hair at your wrist, You may think for a moment that a hand has passed over you in blessing or warning, perhaps both. The ledger in my chest no longer clatters. It rests open to a page where ink has bled into the shape of a loaf. There are still debts. There will be until the earth concludes its arithmetic. But on that page a line runs through a name, not as erasure but as acknowledgement that a sum was met by a currency the oppressor did not believe existed. Patience, needed silence, warmed memory scored into a... So the tale goes on. It has passed in murmurs, in kitchens, in fields, in the narrow shade behind a smokehouse, in the sigh between a preacher's second and third amen. It does not demand belief. It sits, it waits, it rises, it sets itself before you with a humble pride. And when the knife comes, it cracks, softly, twice. Sometimes it breaks bread. Listen. The house is quiet now. The fields drowse, their green eyelids heavy. Somewhere a loaf cools and speaks its small, brittle language. Somewhere a ledger closes, and somewhere in the old dark kitchens of the world, patient hands dust flour from their palms and, without triumph, without shame, lift the silence, warm as a miracle, out of the oven.